Retractor deeper, please. More light right here.
Suction. I can't see the source of the bleed.
The operating room doors slammed open so hard they rattled against the wall. "Stop right there." The voice cut through the room like a blade. A broad-shouldered army captain stood near the surgical table, gloved hands frozen mid-motion. Around him, 3 combat medics and 2 nurses stiffened. Monitors beeped in steady, mechanical rhythm. And in the doorway stood a young nurse. No insignia anyone recognized. No escort. Just a plain hospital uniform and calm eyes that didn't match the chaos inside the room. The captain turned slowly. His expression hardened the second he saw her. "Who the hell cleared you to enter this operating room?" he barked. No one answered. The patient on the table was a wounded special operations soldier. Chest open. Blood loss severe. The kind of case where every second mattered. The nurse stepped forward anyway. "I need to see the chart," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The captain stared at her like she'd just insulted the entire chain of command. "You need to get out," he snapped. "Right now." She didn't move. The room grew tighter. One medic shifted nervously beside the anesthesia machine. Another nurse glanced toward the security officer standing by the door. "Ma'am," the captain said again, slower this time, jaw tightening. "This is a restricted military surgical operation. You don't just walk in here." The nurse's gaze moved to the patient. She studied the monitor, the oxygen levels, the surgeon's instruments laid across the tray. Something in her expression changed. Concern. Sharp. Immediate. She stepped closer. The captain blocked her path with a gloved arm. "That's far enough." Silence settled over the room. The heart monitor beeped again. Beep. Beep. The nurse looked at the captain's hand on her shoulder, then back at his face. "You're operating on the wrong artery," she said quietly. The words landed like a detonation. One of the medics sucked in a breath. The captain's eyes narrowed, disbelief flashing across his face. "You just walked into my operating room," he said slowly, dangerously. "And you think you can tell me how to run a battlefield surgery?" The nurse didn't raise her voice, didn't step back. She only looked at the patient again, and said something that made the entire room go still. "If you keep going," she said calmly, "that soldier dies in less than 3 minutes." The captain's jaw tightened. For a moment, no one moved. The operating room lights burned bright over the table, turning everything sharp and colorless. Steel instruments, surgical drapes, the pale face of the soldier lying open on the table. Beep, beep. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, but the room had gone strangely quiet. Captain Daniel Mercer had been running trauma surgeries in military hospitals for nearly 12 years. Iraq, Afghanistan, field hospitals where the walls shook from artillery and the power flickered during procedures. He didn't make mistakes. Not here. Not now. He looked down at the incision again, irritation simmering beneath the surface. "Clamp," Mercer ordered. A medic immediately placed the instrument in his hand. "Captain?" one of the nurses said cautiously, glancing toward the woman who had walked in. "Should we call hospital command?" Mercer didn't look up. "Security can remove her," he said flatly, "after we stabilize the patient." The security officer by the door shifted, uncertain, because the nurse who had interrupted the surgery still hadn't moved. She stood near the edge of the operating table, eyes scanning the equipment, the monitors, the surgical field. Not nervously, not like someone who had wandered into the wrong room, like someone studying a problem. Mercer finally looked up at her again. "You're interfering with a classified surgical operation involving a special operations casualty," he said coldly. "That means you either leave right now, or you explain who authorized you to be here." A medic leaned toward another and whispered under his breath, "That guy's from the Rangers, I think." The patient on the table was massive, built like a tank. Tattoos along his shoulder hinted at Special Forces units most hospital staff never dealt with directly. He'd arrived by helicopter 30 minutes earlier. Gunshot wound, severe internal bleeding, transported straight from a training accident that had gone catastrophically wrong. Mercer had taken command the moment the gurney rolled through the trauma doors. That was how things worked here. Chain of command. Clear authority. No confusion. But now that chain had just been interrupted by someone no one recognized. The young nurse finally spoke. "I didn't come here to interfere," she said. Her voice stayed calm, controlled. "But that vessel you're clamping isn't the source of the bleed." Mercer let out a short laugh that carried no humor. "You're questioning a trauma surgeon in the middle of an open thoracic operation. I'm pointing out what the monitor is already telling you." That caught the attention of two medics standing near the cardiac monitor. They glanced down at the numbers instinctively. Mercer noticed. His tone hardened immediately. "Eyes on your jobs," he snapped. The medics straightened. The nurse folded her arms loosely, still calm, still watching the patient. Mercer studied her more carefully now. She looked young, late 20s maybe, hospital scrubs like everyone else in the room. But something about her posture didn't match the tension everyone else felt. Most junior nurses avoided trauma theaters like this unless they were assigned. Most certainly didn't argue with a senior military surgeon in the middle of surgery. Yet she stood there like the room belonged to her. Mercer gestured toward the door. "Last warning," he said. "You walk out now, and this ends quietly." The nurse didn't move. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the monitor, then toward the surgical field, and spoke again, almost quietly. "You're chasing the wrong bleed." One of the medics swallowed hard. Mercer's patience snapped. "Security," he said sharply. "Remove." But before the officer could take a step forward, the heart monitor changed. Beep, 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 beep. The rhythm suddenly accelerated. And for the first time since the nurse had entered the room, every person in the operating theater looked back at the patient. The faster rhythm of the heart monitor cut through the room. Beep, 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 beep. The anesthesiologist leaned toward the screen, frowning slightly. "Pressure's dipping," he murmured. Captain Mercer didn't answer immediately. His focus remained on the surgical field, but a thin line had formed between his eyebrows. The numbers on the monitor were shifting faster than he liked. "Clamp pressure," he said sharply. The medic adjusted his grip. For a few seconds, the room returned to the familiar rhythm of controlled chaos. Hands moving, instruments passing, quiet orders exchanged. But the nurse still hadn't left. She stood a few feet from the table now, just outside Mercer's reach, watching the monitors with unsettling patience. Not speaking, not arguing, just watching. One of the junior nurses near the instrument tray glanced at her again, then quickly looked away. Something about the situation felt wrong, though she couldn't explain why. It wasn't just that the woman had walked into a restricted surgical room. It was the way she had done it. No hesitation, no apology, no nervousness, as if she had every right to be standing there. The security officer shifted his weight near the door, clearly unsure whether he should intervene. He looked once toward Mercer, then again toward the unfamiliar nurse. Still, he didn't move. The anesthesiologist cleared his throat. "Captain, heart rate's climbing faster." Mercer finally glanced at the monitor. His jaw tightened slightly. "Temporary response," he muttered. "Blood loss reaction." But even as he said it, he noticed something else. The nurse had moved closer to the monitor. Not dramatically, just a quiet half-step forward. Her eyes scanned the readings quickly: oxygen saturation, blood pressure, cardiac rhythm. She didn't comment, didn't interrupt again, but her expression had changed. Not panic, not even urgency, more like quiet confirmation. One of the medics noticed. "Ma'am," he said under his breath, uncertain. "You really should." She lifted one finger slightly. Not a command, more like a gentle pause. And strangely, the medic stopped talking. Across the room, the security officer frowned. He had escorted plenty of hospital staff out of restricted areas before. Usually they protested. Usually they panicked. This woman wasn't doing either. She looked composed, almost patient, as if she were waiting for something. Mercer spoke again, irritation creeping back into his voice. Suction. The instrument was placed into his hand. But as he worked, something nagged at him. The nurse's words replayed quietly in the back of his mind. You're operating on the wrong artery. He pushed the thought aside. Years of experience didn't disappear because a stranger walked into a room. Still, he glanced briefly toward the monitor again. The numbers weren't stabilizing the way he expected. Behind him, one of the senior nurses, Lieutenant Carla Hayes, had been silent the entire time. Now she looked carefully at the unknown nurse. Not suspiciously. Studying her. Hayes had worked in military hospitals for 8 years. Long enough to read people. And the woman standing near the monitor didn't behave like a junior nurse. It was subtle. The way she stood. The way she watched the surgical field without flinching. The way she spoke earlier, calm, precise, almost clinical. Hayes leaned slightly toward the anesthesiologist. Do we have her name? She whispered. The anesthesiologist shook his head quietly. No badge, he muttered. Didn't check in with trauma intake either. Hayes' gaze returned to the woman. Still calm. Still observing. Across the room, the heart monitor chirped again. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm grew sharper. Mercer noticed it too. His movements slowed for half a second. Then he forced his focus back to the incision. But now the room had changed. No one spoke as easily as before. The medics worked a little more carefully. The nurses passed instruments with quieter hands. Even the security officer had stopped reaching for the door. Because something in the atmosphere had shifted. Not panic. Not yet. Just a creeping sense that the moment was sliding somewhere none of them had expected. The unknown nurse glanced once more at the monitor. Then at the surgical field. Then back to Mercer. She opened her mouth slightly, as if deciding whether to speak again. But this time, she said nothing. That quiet shift in rhythm that every trauma surgeon learned to recognize. The subtle warning that something inside the patient was spiraling beyond the plan. Pressure? He asked. Dropping, the anesthesiologist replied. 80/50/78. Mercer's jaw tightened. That's impossible, he muttered. We controlled the bleed. He leaned closer to the incision, scanning the surgical field with sharper focus. But something wasn't lining up. The blood loss was still coming. Not flooding, but persistent. Hidden. Like it was escaping somewhere he hadn't sealed. Across the table, the unknown nurse watched the monitor again. Her eyes flicked from the heart rate to the blood pressure, then to the angle of Mercer's clamp. She exhaled quietly. Lieutenant Hayes noticed it. Something you want to say? Hayes asked carefully. The nurse hesitated. Not nervously. More like someone deciding whether a warning would actually matter. Not yet, she said. Hayes frowned slightly. Not yet. That wasn't the answer she expected. At the surgical table, Mercer spoke again. Another clamp. The instrument landed in his palm. He adjusted position, tightening his control on the artery he believed was responsible. But the monitor told a different story. Beep, 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 beep. The rhythm edged higher. The anesthesiologist looked up now. Captain, we're losing pressure faster. I see it, Mercer snapped. Behind him, one of the medics wiped sweat from his forehead. The room temperature hadn't changed, but the tension had. Across the room, the security officer leaned closer to Hayes. Should I remove her? He whispered. Hayes didn't answer immediately. She kept watching the nurse instead. Because the woman's eyes weren't on Mercer anymore. They were on the surgical tray. More specifically, on a particular instrument Mercer hadn't used yet. A longer clamp. Hayes noticed the nurse glance at it. Then at the surgical field again. Like she was measuring something invisible. Then the nurse spoke softly. Your suction angle is hiding it. Mercer froze. Not completely, but long enough for everyone nearby to notice. What did you say? He asked slowly. The nurse gestured, not toward the incision directly, but slightly above it. You're pulling blood away from the wrong direction, she said. The bleed isn't where you think it is. The medic holding the suction tube hesitated instinctively. Mercer's irritation flared again. Keep suction where I told you, he ordered. The medic immediately obeyed. But now Hayes was staring at the monitor. The nurse hadn't raised her voice, hadn't argued. She had simply pointed something out. Again. And twice now the monitor had shifted immediately after. Coincidence? Maybe. But Hayes had seen coincidence inside trauma rooms before. It usually didn't repeat itself like this. Across the room, the anesthesiologist leaned closer to the monitor. Heart rate 140, he said quietly. Mercer cursed under his breath. The patient's body was fighting harder now. Blood loss, stress, shock creeping closer. Prepare additional transfusion, Mercer ordered. The medic nodded quickly. Meanwhile, the unknown nurse stepped closer to the table again. Still outside Mercer's immediate space. Still careful not to touch anything. But now she was close enough to see the incision clearly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she said something almost under her breath. 3 centimeters higher. Hayes heard it. So did the medic beside her. What? The medic asked quietly. The nurse didn't repeat it. She just kept watching Mercer's hands. Across the table, Mercer felt something else now. Not doubt. Not exactly. More like awareness. He knew people were watching him differently. The room had gone quieter. Even the medics had slowed their movements slightly. And behind him, he could feel the presence of the woman who had walked in like she belonged there. Mercer adjusted the clamp again. Still chasing the bleed he believed he had located. But the numbers kept shifting. Pressure dropping. Heart rate climbing. Across the room, Hayes finally spoke. Captain. Mercer didn't look up. Yes. Hayes hesitated before choosing her words. Maybe we should check. No. The response came instantly. Flat. Controlled. Mercer had spent years proving he could handle high-pressure trauma cases. He wasn't about to change course because of a stranger's suggestion. But the nurse didn't react to his refusal. She simply looked at the monitor again. Then back to the surgical field. Then quietly reached toward the surgical tray. Not touching anything. Just hovering over one specific instrument. The longer clamp Hayes had noticed earlier. The nurse tapped the edge of the tray lightly. Just once. A soft metal click. Mercer's eyes flicked toward the sound. For half a second, their gazes met. And in that brief moment, Mercer saw something that unsettled him more than the falling numbers on the monitor. Not arrogance. Not panic. Certainty. The kind of certainty people only carried when they had seen something before. Many times. Behind Mercer, the heart monitor suddenly spiked again. Beep, 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 beep. Pressure 70. The anesthesiologist warned. Mercer's attention snapped back to the incision. But now, somewhere in the back of his mind, the nurse's quiet words echoed again. 3 centimeters higher. Pressure 65. The anesthesiologist warned. The room tightened instantly. Captain Mercer felt the shift in the patient's pulse beneath his fingers. The rhythm had turned unstable now, dangerously close to collapse. He scanned the incision again. Nothing made sense. The bleed should have stopped. But it hadn't. Behind him, the nurse spoke again. Calm. Steady. 3 centimeters higher. Mercer exhaled sharply through his mask. I said enough. But this time, Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward. Captain, she said carefully. We're losing him. Mercer didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the surgical field. But doubt had finally crept into the edge of his focus. Behind him, the nurse reached into the pocket of her scrub top. The motion was small, quiet, but Hayes noticed. So did the security officer by the door. The nurse pulled out a thin, worn leather badge holder. She flipped it open, not toward Mercer, toward Hayes. For half a second, Hayes simply stared. Then her entire posture changed. Her back straightened instantly. Her hand moved away from the instrument tray. And without hesitation, she snapped to attention. Captain, Hayes said, her voice suddenly sharp with formal respect. You need to see this. Mercer looked up, irritation already forming. What? Hayes stepped aside. The nurse held the badge open now, angled toward the surgical lights. A gold insignia caught the reflection. Alongside it, a line of credentials Mercer had only ever seen once before in his career. His eyes locked on the name, then on the seal beneath it. For a moment, The entire room froze. The anesthesiologist leaned slightly closer. One medic whispered under his breath, "Wait, that's—" Mercer's voice disappeared, because suddenly he understood exactly who had been standing behind him this entire time. The nurse closed the badge slowly, then looked back at the surgical field. Her voice remained calm, professional, authoritative. "Move your clamp," she said. 3 centimeters higher. No one questioned her this time. Not a single person in the room. For half a second, Captain Mercer didn't move. Then the training took over. He shifted the clamp. 3 centimeters higher. The moment the instrument closed around the vessel, the change was immediate. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The room went silent except for the steady hiss of oxygen and the mechanical rhythm of the monitor. Beep, beep, beep. The anesthesiologist leaned closer to the screen. "Pressure stabilizing," he said carefully. 75 climbing. No one spoke. Not the medics. Not the security officer. And certainly not Mercer. He stared at the surgical field, his mind replaying the last 10 minutes with uncomfortable clarity. The warnings, the monitor shifts, the quiet certainty in the nurse's voice. Across the table, Lieutenant Hayes moved again, passing the correct instrument without being asked. Her posture was still rigid, professional, but the tension in the room had changed. Not panic anymore, respect. The kind that settled over a room when people realized they had almost ignored the one person who understood the situation best. The nurse stepped closer now. Not dramatically, just enough to observe the repair Mercer was completing. She didn't take control of the surgery, didn't correct his hands. She simply watched, and Mercer felt that presence more clearly than anything else in the room. A moment earlier he had been the unquestioned authority in the operating theater. Now the balance had shifted, not through humiliation, not through confrontation, just quiet competence. "Good," the nurse said softly after a moment. The word wasn't sarcastic. It sounded like professional confirmation. Mercer finished the repair, secured the vessel, and stepped back slightly. The anesthesiologist spoke again. Heart rate dropping, pressure 90. A medic exhaled for the first time in minutes. The soldier on the table was stabilizing. Gradually, carefully, but clearly alive. Mercer removed his gloves slowly and dropped them into the disposal bin. For a moment he just stood there, processing. Around him, the room began moving again. Instruments were counted, gauze replaced. Standard surgical procedures resumed like the rhythm of the room had been reset. But the atmosphere remained different, more focused, more aware. Mercer finally turned toward the nurse. She had already stepped back from the table, hands folded loosely behind her back. Calm again, like she had been the entire time. He held her gaze for a moment. There were 100 things he could have said. Questions, explanations, defenses, but none of them seemed necessary anymore. Instead, Mercer gave a small nod. Professional, acknowledging what had just happened. The nurse returned the nod just as simply. No triumph, no lecture, just understanding. Across the room, Hayes quietly instructed the security officer to stand down. The man relaxed immediately, stepping away from the door, and the operating room returned to its work. But no one in that room would forget the moment the quiet nurse had walked through the doors and changed the course of the surgery without ever raising her voice. The surgery ended just after midnight. Not with applause. Not with relief loud enough to break the silence of the hospital corridors. Just the quiet routine that always followed a long operation. The final sutures were placed. The monitors stabilized into steady, predictable rhythms. The surgical lights dimmed slightly as the patient was prepared for transfer to intensive care. The wounded soldier was still unconscious when the team rolled the gurney out of the operating room. But he was alive. And inside a military hospital, that was the only outcome that ever truly mattered. Captain Mercer stood at the stainless steel sink outside the operating room, letting the hot water run over his hands long after the soap had washed away. The hallway was quiet now, the late-night shift moving with the slow rhythm of exhaustion and routine. Behind him, Lieutenant Hayes finished updating the surgical report at a nearby station. Neither of them spoke for a while. The events of the last hour hung quietly in the air. In military medicine, mistakes weren't something people liked to discuss openly. Not because doctors refused responsibility, but because every decision happened under pressure where hesitation could cost lives. Still, Mercer knew exactly what had happened inside that room. He dried his hands and stared for a moment at the floor. Not angry, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. The nurse's words replayed in his mind again. 3 centimeters higher. Simple, precise, delivered without challenge or ego. Mercer had spent most of his career believing authority inside the operating room needed to be absolute. The chain of command kept chaos from spreading, kept teams moving when seconds mattered. And most of the time that belief had served him well. But authority had a quiet weakness too, could make people stop listening. Even when the right answer was standing only a few feet away. Across the hallway, Hayes finally closed the report folder. "She saved him," she said. Mercer didn't argue, because the truth inside the operating room had been impossible to ignore. He had corrected the clamp, but she had found the bleed. After a moment, Mercer spoke. "Where is she now?" Hayes shrugged slightly. "She left about 10 minutes ago." Left. Didn't say much. Just confirmed the patient was stable and walked out. Mercer nodded slowly. That didn't surprise him. Some professionals didn't stay around for recognition. They simply did their work and moved on to the next place they were needed. Still, one question lingered. "You saw the badge clearly?" Mercer asked. Hayes nodded. "Clear enough." She didn't repeat what was written on it. She didn't need to. The credentials alone had explained everything about the quiet certainty the nurse had carried into the operating room. Not a junior staff member. Not someone guessing. Someone who had spent years studying exactly the kind of injury lying on Mercer's table. Someone whose authority didn't come from rank in that room, but from experience that stretched far beyond it. Mercer leaned against the wall and exhaled slowly. The security officer who had stood outside the operating room earlier passed through the hallway now, nodding politely as he continued his patrol. The hospital had already returned to its normal rhythm. Another trauma case had arrived in the emergency department. A helicopter could be heard faintly in the distance. Inside military hospitals, there was always another patient coming. Another decision waiting. Another moment where someone had to act quickly and trust their judgment. But Mercer knew something had shifted for him tonight. Not his confidence. Not his skill. Those things were still there. What had changed was something quieter. Awareness. The understanding that authority in a room didn't mean every answer belonged to the person giving the orders. Sometimes the most important voice was the calm one that spoke only once. And waited to be heard. Hayes stood and walked toward the corridor leading to the ICU. "I'm checking on the patient," she said. Mercer nodded. "I'll join you in a minute." She disappeared down the hallway. Mercer remained where he was for another moment. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above him. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and steel. He thought again about the moment she had entered the room. No introduction. No explanation. Just quiet confidence. Most people would have been intimidated stepping into a military surgical theater full of officers and combat medics. She hadn't been, because she hadn't come there to challenge anyone. She had come there to make sure a soldier lived. And when the moment came, she had said exactly what needed to be said. Nothing more. Nothing less. Mercer pushed himself away from the wall and started down the hallway toward the ICU. The soldier in recovery would never know how close he had come to dying on that table. He would wake up later surrounded by machines, doctors, and nurses. He would hear that the surgery had been complicated, that the team had worked hard, that he had been lucky. What he would never see was the quiet moment when the course of that surgery had changed. The moment when someone who could have demanded authority instead chose something far more powerful. Clarity. Mercer reached the ICU doors and paused briefly before pushing them open. Inside, the soldier's recovery had already begun. And somewhere in the hospital, the nurse who had walked into the operating room earlier was likely already moving on to the next patient who needed her. No announcement. No ceremony. Just another quiet act of service inside a place where lives were balanced on small decisions every single day. Mercer stepped inside the ICU and glanced toward the soldier's bed. The monitors were steady. The breathing tube moved gently with each assisted breath. Stable. Alive. And as Mercer watched the machines rise and fall in their steady rhythm, one thought settled clearly in his mind. Respect wasn't always about rank. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to listen.